Hello everyone, welcome back to Nightfall lore. Tonight we are doing something a little different. We are not going through facts or secrets or hidden details. Tonight we are telling the entire story of Elden Ring Nightreign, from the very beginning to the very end. The complete picture, the full narrative, everything that happened and why it happened and what it means. Told slowly, carefully, and with enough depth that by the time we are done you will understand this world as completely as any lore video can give you. If you are new to Nightreign, this is the video to start with. If you have played it and want to understand the story you experienced, this is the video that puts all the pieces together. And if you're simply here because you need something rich and immersive and carefully told to carry you into sleep, you are in exactly the right place. Before we begin, get comfortable. Let your body settle into wherever you are resting. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let the sounds outside soften until there is nothing left but this. We're going to be here for a while, and there is nowhere you need to be except exactly where you are. And before the story begins, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Your bed, your couch, your desk with headphones in at midnight. I read every single one. It means more than you know. So let us begin at the beginning, because every story has one. And the story of Nightreign begins long before the first Nightfarer ever set foot in Limveld. The water that bordered the pre-catastrophe civilization carried, even then, traces of what was coming. Not because the catastrophe was inevitable in any fatalistic sense, but because the forces that would eventually produce it were always present at the edges of the world the civilization built, always pressing against the boundaries it maintained, always expressing themselves in the small anomalies and unexplained occurrences that the civilization's institutions explained away as weather, as natural variation, as things that did not require the kind of attention that would have been uncomfortable to give them. The civilization was not blind. It was busy. It was engaged in the work of maintaining itself, and the work of maintaining a civilization is demanding enough that the things at the edges of attention tend to stay at the edges until they can no longer be ignored. The specific relationship between Limveld and the lands between, the question of whether they are truly alternate worlds or something more intimate, something more like two expressions of a shared template that diverged at a point that might still be identifiable if you knew where to look, is one that the game's lore raises without resolving. The similarities are too specific to be coincidental. The differences are too deep to be superficial. What this suggests is a relationship that is neither simple parallelism nor simple identity, but something in between, something that the conceptual vocabulary of alternate worlds only partially captures. Limveld is not simply the lands between with different choices made at some branching point in history. It is the lands between's principle applied to a different cosmological substrate, the same architectural instinct expressed through different materials. The building looks similar, the foundation is different, and the foundation is what determines what the building can withstand. To understand what Limveld is, you first have to understand what it was before it became what it is now, and to understand that, you have to go back further than most people expect. Not to the events of Elden Ring, not to the shattering or the breaking of the Elden Ring or the wars of the demigods, further back than all of that. Back to the age before the Erdtree, when a different order governed the world and the forces that would eventually shape Limveld were still in their earliest expressions. The world that would become the lands between was not always golden. Before the Erdtree rose and the Golden Order established its dominance, there was a different order entirely. The Crucible, that primordial state of life where all living things were connected in a vast and fluid web of shared existence, was the world's original condition. Animals and plants and creatures that defied categorization blended and overlapped in ways that seemed monstrous by the standards of the Golden Order's civilization, but that were, in that ancient time, simply the nature of life. The Crucible was not chaos. It was a different kind of order, one organized around connection and fluidity rather than hierarchy and fixed identity. The Greater Will changed all of this. That outer God, that incomprehensible cosmic force whose attention shaped the lands between for the entirety of the age we know about, brought with it the Elden Ring, the fundamental law of a new order. And with that law came the Erdtree, the golden grace, the promise of quasi-immortality for those the Order favoured, and the systematic replacement of the Crucible's fluid world with something more structured, more hierarchical, more fixed. The Golden Order did not simply arrive. It displaced something that was already there, and what it displaced did not disappear. It persisted, underground and in the margins, in the creatures that still bore Crucible aspects, and the places that still remembered the old connection. This displacement matters for understanding Nightreign, because Limveld is, in part, a world where the displacement went differently, where the forces that the Golden Order suppressed and contained in the lands between found more room to operate, where the relationship between the Old Order and the New was resolved in a different direction, producing a world that looks like the lands between from a distance, but that is, at its cosmological foundations, organized according to different principles. The civilization that existed in Limveld before the catastrophe that created its current state was recognizably related to the civilization of the lands between. It shared institutions, traditions, and cosmological frameworks that mark it as descended from the same root. There was an Erdtree, or something that functioned as one. There were sites of grace, connections to the divine, hierarchies of power organized around the Golden Order's principles. There were roads and cities and people who believed in the future enough to build infrastructure that would take generations to pay off. The pre-catastrophe Limveld was, from the outside, a world that looked like it was doing what the lands between was doing, following the same arc, moving in the same direction. But the foundations were different. The relationship between the Golden Order's civilization and the forces it had suppressed was different in Limveld than in the lands between. The crucible aspects that the lands between's Golden Order had contained and marginalized were more present in Limveld's version, less completely suppressed, maintaining a more active tension with the institutions that claimed dominance over them. The outer gods that pressed against the edges of the lands between's reality were in a slightly different configuration relative to Limveld, their influence distributed differently, their points of entry into the world located in different places. These differences were not catastrophic in themselves. A world can sustain significant internal tension without collapsing. What changed was the arrival of something from outside, something that the tension in Limveld's foundations made it specifically vulnerable to in a way that the lands between, for all its own problems, was not. The Nightlords did not simply happen to Limveld, they were drawn to it, or created for it. The specific nature of the world's cosmological organization made it the right kind of world for what the Nightlords represent, and the civilization that had built its roads and its cathedrals and its sites of grace on top of that organization had no way of knowing that what they had built was, in a very specific sense, already compromised before any external threat appeared. The people of pre-catastrophe Limveld were not weak. They were not foolish or careless or insufficiently devoted to their gods. They were a civilization doing what civilizations do, building on the foundations they'd been given, working within the frameworks they had inherited, making the best of a world they did not fully understand, because no civilization ever fully understands the world it lives in. They built roads that still exist. They raised structures whose ruins the Nightfarers now use for shelter and exploration. They established traditions whose echoes can be found in the item descriptions of the most ancient equipment available in the game. They were real in the way that all the lost civilizations of the lands between were real, present in their ruins and their artifacts and the specific quality of their absence. What ended them was not a failure on their part. It was a structural vulnerability that the architecture of their world contained. A vulnerability that the Nightlords exploited with the patient precision of forces that have been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. A civilization based on stability is specifically vulnerable to instability. A world organized around the principles of order is specifically vulnerable to the forces that thrive in disorder. The civilization of pre-catastrophe Limveld was not weak. It was specifically brittle, and the specific forces that came for it knew exactly where to press. The ruins that the Nightfarers walk through in their expeditions are the physical record of this civilization's end. The roads still connect the places they were built to connect, but the places are ruins now. The cathedrals still stand in outline, but their interiors have been transformed by the forces that followed the catastrophe. The sites of grace still glow, but they flicker, uncertain, no longer reliably connected to the source of their light. Everything that the civilization built persists in some form. Nothing of what it built persists intact. This is what the catastrophe did to Limveld. Not erasure, transformation. The world was not destroyed, it was changed at every level into something that still bears the shape of what it was while being fundamentally other than what it was. Understanding this transformation, the gap between the world that existed and the world that exists now, is the foundation for understanding everything else about Nightreign. The Nightlords are the agents of the transformation. The Nightfarers are the response to it. The three nights are its ongoing expression, and the endings are the different possible relationships between the world as it was, the world as it is, and the world as it might become. The specific sequence in which the Nightlords establish their dominance in Limveld is encoded in the ruins and their relationship to each other in ways that careful exploration can reconstruct. The areas most thoroughly transformed by Gladius's influence are the oldest ruins, the ones that show the earliest evidence of the civilization's collapse. The areas most marked by Libra's principle are slightly more recent, layered on top of the ruins that Gladius's escalation of conflict produced. Maris's presence is evident in the deep places, in the underground spaces and the coastal areas, where the sea's reach has extended far beyond what any natural process would produce. And Equilibrion's marks are the most recent and the most comprehensive, covering areas that the other Nightlords' influences had already destabilized, and adding to that destabilization the specific quality of irresolvable opposition that prevents even the damaged structures of the old civilization from achieving a new form of equilibrium. Reading the ruins in this sequence is reading the catastrophe as a process rather than as an event. Each layer of damage corresponds to a stage, each stage built on what the previous one had already disrupted. The civilization did not fall at once because the catastrophe did not arrive at once. It fell piece by piece, as each stage of the process found the weaknesses that the previous stage had exposed and exploited them with the specific thoroughness of forces that do not get tired and do not have other priorities. The ruins of Limveld are the record of this thoroughness, the physical archive of a process that ran to completion, that took everything the civilization had built and transformed it into something that bears the shape of what it was while being organised around completely different principles. The catastrophe that created Limveld as we know it did not happen all at once. This is one of the most important facts about it, and one of the most counterintuitive. When we think of catastrophes, we tend to think of singular events, moments of rupture that divide everything into before and after with a clear and definite line between them. The catastrophe of Limveld was not like this. It was a process, a slow unravelling that began long before its effects became visible in the physical world, and that continues, in a certain sense, through the present day of the game's events. The first stage of the catastrophe was cosmological. Something changed in the relationship between Limveld and the outer forces that had always exerted influence on it. The greater will's attention, that golden light whose presence sustained the sights of grace and authorized the Golden Order's dominance, became less consistent, not absent, not withdrawn, simply less certain than it had been. The first sights of grace that began to flicker were not noticed as a warning. They were treated as local anomalies, maintenance problems, things that could be addressed through the ordinary mechanisms of religious and institutional practice. The flicker was the first symptom of something that had already gone wrong at a level that ordinary mechanisms could not reach. The second stage was biological. The crucible aspects that the Golden Order's civilization had spent generations suppressing began reasserting themselves in the natural world. Flora and fauna that bore the marks of the Old Order started appearing in places where they should not have been, in the managed spaces of the civilization rather than in its margins. This was not simply an ecological change. It was the world's underlying nature pressing through the structures that had been built to contain it, finding the cracks in those structures and widening them. The civilization's response was to double down on the containment, to assert the Golden Order's principles more forcefully in the places where the old nature was reasserting itself. This response was understandable and completely insufficient. The third stage was when the Nightlords arrived, or more precisely, when the Nightlords became present in ways that the world could no longer ignore. Whether they had always been present in some form, waiting in the cosmological spaces that the flickering grace lights were beginning to expose, or whether they arrived from somewhere outside Limveld entirely in response to the world's developing vulnerability, is a question the game does not resolve. What it establishes clearly is that the Nightlords did not create Limveld's vulnerability. They exploited it. They found a world whose internal tensions had been building for longer than its population had been aware, and they expressed themselves through those tensions in ways that accelerated and completed what was already in process. Gladius was first, or at least Gladius's presence was first felt in a way that the civilization could not explain away as anomaly or local problem. The principle of pure martial force, of the reduction of all interaction to conflict, began expressing itself in Limveld's world in ways that moved beyond the ordinary violence that any civilization contains. Conflicts that should have been resolved through the civilization's normal mechanisms of law and hierarchy and negotiation simply did not resolve. They escalated. Every attempt to contain them produced new conflicts. Every resolution became a new opening for further conflict, because Gladius's principle, once fully active in a world, does not permit the kind of closure that resolution requires. It requires ongoing conflict because ongoing conflict is what it is. The civilization's response to this escalation was itself an expression of the problem. They fought. They deployed their military resources, their trained warriors, their institutional mechanisms for organized violence. They attempted to contain the escalating conflicts through force, which is a reasonable response to ordinary conflict and a catastrophically wrong response to a conflict that is the expression of a principle that feeds on force. Every battle fought against Gladius's influence strengthened it. Every warrior deployed to contain the violence contributed their martial energy to the force they were fighting against. The civilization was fighting a losing battle, not because it lacked skill or courage or resources, but because the nature of what it was fighting made resistance into fuel. Libra's arrival was subtler and in some ways more devastating. The principle of absolute judgment, of the reduction of all value to a single objective accounting, began expressing itself in the civilization's institutions. Courts that had once balanced competing considerations became instruments of absolute verdict. Religious authorities that had once accommodated the complexity of human moral life began demanding perfect conformity to precise standards. The flexibility that any living civilization requires to function, the ability to weigh context and intention and consequence against each other and arrive at judgments that are imperfect but workable, disappeared from Limveld's institutions as Libra's influence deepened. What remained was a civilization that knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, that could calculate with perfect precision and understand with perfect incomprehension. Maris came from below, from the depths of the water that had always bordered Limveld's landscapes but had always been in some sense contained. The sea had its place. It was outside. It was managed. It was the source of things the civilization needed, but was not the civilization itself. Maris's presence changed this. The water began pressing against its boundaries in ways that went beyond seasonal flooding or storm damage. It began appearing in places it should not have been able to reach, inland, underground, in spaces that the civilization's geography had assured itself were safe from the sea's reach. The ancient things that Maris represented, the forces that had waited in the deep water since before the Golden Order established its dominance, began making themselves felt in the world that had assumed their long silence was permanent consent. Equilibrion arrived last among the original Nightlords, and its arrival was the most complete expression of what the catastrophe ultimately was. The principle of opposing forces held in perfect tension, of the stasis that results from perfectly matched pressures pressing against each other with neither capable of yielding, began expressing itself in every dimension of the civilization's life. Political conflicts that had previously resolved through compromise became permanent standoffs. Theological disputes that had previously found workable accommodations became irreconcilable oppositions. Relationships between individuals and communities that had previously been able to move and grow became fixed, frozen in positions of mutual opposition that neither party could abandon without surrendering something essential. The civilization did not fall all at once. It ran down. The conflicts multiplied and escalated and consumed resources and attention and eventually lives. The institutions that had maintained the civilization's coherence became, one by one, expressions of the principles they were trying to resist rather than defences against them. The roads stopped being maintained. The cathedrals stopped being tended. The sites of grace flickered and went dark, and the connections they represented to whatever source of divine attention had sustained the Golden Order's civilization in this world became unreliable and then absent. The people who had built this world, who had believed in its future enough to invest in infrastructure and institutions and all the things that civilizations build when they think they will last, found themselves in a world that was becoming something else without their consent and beyond their capacity to prevent. What remained when the process completed was Limveld as the Nightfarers find it, a world that bears the shape of the civilization that built it, while being organized around completely different principles. The roads are still there, but the people who built them are not. The ruins are still there, but the purposes they served are not. The sites of grace are still there, but their light is uncertain, filtered through cosmological conditions that have changed at a fundamental level since they were established. It is a world of profound and specific loss that is encoded in every detail of its landscape, loss that can be read by those patient enough to look at what is absent from the things that remain. The relationships between specific pairs of Nightfarers, the specific dynamics that emerge when certain characters are in the same expedition together, are encoded in dialogue fragments and behavioural details that accumulate across multiple runs into a picture of a community that is more than the sum of its individual members. The welder and the executor have a dynamic that is not quite friendship and not quite rivalry, but something that is produced by the specific combination of their respective histories. Two people who have had very different relationships to institutional authority, arriving at a similar destination through completely different routes. The Duchess and the Recluse have a dynamic shaped by the contrast between inherited authority and earned knowledge, between the person who carries a lineage that requires no justification and the person who has had to justify every step of her intellectual development to institutions that were not always sympathetic. These relational dynamics are not simply character flavouring. They are the game's argument for why cooperation specifically, rather than simply the presence of multiple capable individuals, produces outcomes that individuals alone cannot. The Wilder's pragmatism is sharpened by the executor's capacity for principled judgment. The Duchess's historical perspective is grounded by the Recluse's empirical orientation. The Guardian's determination is humanized by the Raider's community instinct. The Revenant's uncertainty about their own continuity finds a different kind of stability in the Iron Eye's acceptance of impermanence. The Nightfarers need each other not just tactically but constitutively, not just for what each can do but for what each becomes in relation to the others. The calling that brought each Nightfarer to Limveld was specific in another way that deserves attention. It was timed. The Nightfarers did not all arrive at the same moment from the same direction. They arrived in a sequence or in clusters that the game's NPC dialogue hints at without making fully explicit. Some Nightfarers have been coming to Limveld for longer than others. Some are more familiar with its patterns, more adapted to its rhythms, carrying a relationship to the world that was built over multiple expeditions rather than beginning fresh with each new arrival. The community that the Nightfarers constitute is not static. It is ongoing, accumulating, building towards something that requires the full participation of all 8, rather than simply the competence of any subset. The Nightfarers did not volunteer. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about them, and the thing that most fundamentally shapes how their stories read. They were called. Something in Limveld, or something operating through Limveld, reached out to specific individuals across the world and drew them to this place. The calling was not a request. It was not an invitation that could be declined. It was a pull, a compulsion, a sense of necessary direction that the people who experienced it found impossible to resist and difficult to explain to those who did not. Why these 8? What made these specific individuals the ones who were called rather than any of the countless other people who existed in whatever worlds they came from? The answer is not power. The Nightfarers are formidable, but they are not the most powerful beings in their respective worlds. It is not destiny in any simple sense. There is no prophecy that names them. It is not even exactly virtue, though several of them are admirable people in their own complicated ways. What distinguishes the Nightfarers from those who are not called is a specific relationship to loss. Each of them has lost something, or failed at something, or been cut off from something, in a way that has left them carrying a particular quality of incompletion. Limveld is a world of incompletion, a world that was interrupted mid-process, that never finished becoming what it was trying to become. The Nightfarers are people who know what it is to be interrupted mid-process. They were chosen because the world recognized something of itself in them. The Wielder is the first of the 8, and in many ways the most immediately legible. They are a warrior, a fighter who has spent their life in various conflicts, serving various causes, demonstrating a skill in combat that is undeniable, and a loyalty to any particular cause that is more complicated. The Wilders. History is one of service and betrayal, not necessarily betrayal by others, though that appears to have occurred, but also the subtler betrayal of discovering that the things you fought for were not what you believed them to be. They came to their current state of itinerant purposelessness, not through cowardice or selfishness, but through a series of disappointments in causes that turned out to be unworthy of the commitment they received. What the Wielder carries from this history into Limveld is a specific kind of competence uncoupled from conviction. They know how to fight, they know how to survive, they know how to adapt to circumstances that other people would find impossibly difficult. What they have lost is the belief that any of this is in service of something worth serving. Limveld gives them something unexpected, not a cause to believe in, exactly, but a context in which their competence has clear and immediate value, in which the question of what they are fighting for does not require a satisfying philosophical answer, because the immediate answer, survival, and the protection of the people next to them in the 3 nights, is sufficient. The Wielder does not find meaning in Limveld. They find enough. The Duchess arrives in Limveld carrying a weight that is the inverse of the Wielder's lightness. Where the Wielder has shed all institutional identity, the Duchess is defined by hers. She comes from a lineage of the Golden Order's civilization, a specific heritage of power and responsibility that was legitimate in its time and has since been complicated by the collapse of the structures that legitimized it. Her training, her bearing, her relationship to the world, all of it is formed by an institution that no longer exists in the form that shaped her. She is, in the most precise sense, a person whose entire identity was constructed for a context that has since been removed. The specific marks on her weapons place her lineage at a particular moment in the Golden Order's history, a moment that predates the events of the base game by a significant span. This detail, encoded in the item descriptions that most players pass over, suggests something extraordinary about the Duchess. She's not simply a descendant of the Golden Order's tradition, she's a living connection to an earlier expression of it, a form of the civilization that was already historical before the events of the original game. How this is possible, whether she is genuinely ancient or whether something about her specific lineage has preserved across time in ways that defy normal biographical continuity, is one of the mysteries the game preserves around her without resolving. The Guardian entered Limveld in the grip of something that most people would recognize as guilt. Though the Guardian might not use that word, they failed. Something was entrusted to their protection that was not protected. and the failure was real and consequential, and not amenable to the kind of rationalizations that make other failures easier to live with. The armour they wear in Limveld, that heavy and distinctive gear that is among the most immediately recognisable of the Nightfarers' visual signatures, is not simply their combat equipment. It is their penance made physical. They are wearing the evidence of their failure, keeping it in contact with their body, refusing the comfort of putting it away. This is not masochism. It is a specific kind of moral seriousness, a refusal to let the failure be abstracted into memory when keeping it concrete might eventually produce the worthiness that the failure demonstrated was absent. In Limveld, the Guardian finds a world that constantly tests the specific quality they failed to demonstrate. Every expedition is an opportunity to protect. Every companion is an opportunity to succeed where they previously failed. Whether this opportunity is therapeutic, or whether it is simply the extension of a compulsion that has replaced healthy motivation with something more driven and less sustainable, is a question the game allows each player to answer differently, depending on how they engage with the character. The Recluse is the scholar of the group, or was before the expulsion. She came from an institution of learning, one connected to the sorcerous traditions of the Lands Between's world, and she left it, or was made to leave it, because of research that the institution could not accommodate. The specific nature of that research, hinted at in item descriptions and more fully elaborated in the Forsaken Hollows DLC, involved the very forces that Limveld represents. She was, before anyone used the word Limveld, investigating the phenomenon of cosmological instability, the possibility of worlds adjacent to the lands between organised around different principles. She was expelled not for being wrong, but for being right in a way that the institution found dangerous. This backstory gives the Recluse a relationship to Limveld that is unique among the Nightfarers. She did not simply arrive in a strange world. She arrived in the world she had been theorising about. Every discovery she makes in Limveld is simultaneously a confirmation of her research and a demonstration of the stakes involved in that research. She understood in the abstract what Limveld was. Being present in it is the difference between understanding a fire and being in one. The Iron Eye has spent long enough in difficult circumstances that the difficulty has stopped being something they struggle against, and started being something they navigate. This is not the same thing as peace, though it looks like peace from the outside. It is a specific adaptation, the result of enough exposure to impermanence that the impermanence has been incorporated rather than merely endured. The Iron Eye fights with a precision and a calm that other Nightfarers find either reassuring or unsettling depending on their own relationship to equanimity, because the calm is genuine and the precision is real, but both exist in a context of having let go of something that most people hold on to as a condition of functioning. What was let go is present in the Iron Eye's history as an absence, a space where something used to be that the character's current orientation is organised around not having. The specific nature of what was released is encoded in item descriptions that the most attentive players find and piece together across multiple expeditions. It was a relationship, or a community, or a belief, something that gave the Iron Eye's life a specific kind of orientation that is now gone, and the peace on the other side of that loss is genuine peace, and also a peace that cost everything it cost. The raider came from somewhere that valued strength and collective solidarity above most other things, a community organised around shared capacity rather than individual achievement. In a world of the Golden Order's hierarchies, such communities existed at the margins, in the spaces between the great institutions, maintaining traditions of mutual dependence that the Order's civilization found either quaint or threatening depending on its current mood. The Raiders' community was real. The solidarity it offered was real. The specific capabilities it developed in its members, including the Raider, were real. And then something happened to it, something that the Raider survived and the community did not, and the Raider arrived in Limveld carrying the habits of a collective existence that no longer has a collective to express them in. The fighting style is the most visible expression of this. The Raider fights as though others are always present, creating openings and managing space in ways that make most sense in a group context even when the Raider is alone. The community is still in the muscles, still in the trained instincts, still in every combat decision that was shaped by years of operating as part of something larger. Whether the Raider can eventually let go of a community that no longer exists, or whether they will carry it forward in their body indefinitely, is something the game explores across multiple expeditions and multiple endings. The Executor served. That is the simplest and the most complete description of who the Executor is. They served an institution or a cause or a specific authority, served it with the specific commitment of someone who has found in service itself a form of identity, who has organized their sense of self around the role of being the instrument through which someone else's judgment is carried into effect. The title is both description and name. The person and the function collapsed into a single word, because for most of the Executor's history, the distinction between them was not meaningful. What has complicated this is the evidence that has accumulated over a long career of faithful service, that the judgments being executed were not always as righteous as the authority delivering them claimed. The Executor has done things, real things, things that required skill and commitment and the willingness to carry out difficult assignments without flinching, and the things they were assigned to do were authorized by something that turned out to be less worthy of authorization than it appeared. The Executor in Limveld is a person discovering, slowly and with considerable discomfort, that the instrument can have a perspective on the judgment it carries out. That being the means does not eliminate the capacity to evaluate the end. The Revenant died. This is stated simply because it is the simplest and most accurate description of what happened. Something that functions like dying occurred, and something that functions like coming back followed it, and what came back is most but not entirely all of what went in. The gap between the before and the after is small enough that most people who interact with the Revenant do not notice it, but the Revenant notices it. The Revenant is always slightly aware of the gap, always slightly monitoring the question of whether the continuity of self that ordinary experience assumes is actually present, or whether it is being performed from habit, by a being that is similar enough to the original to fool most observers, including on good days themselves. In Limveld, where the question of identity and continuity is raised by the world itself, where a place that looks like another place asks you to decide whether resemblance is the same as sameness, the Revenant finds a world that understands their specific situation in a way that no other world they have inhabited has. The uncertainty that defines the Revenant's relationship to their own existence is the same uncertainty that defines Limveld's relationship to the lands between. Both are asking the same question. Both are living with an answer that is genuinely unclear. The specific things that are accessible at different points within each night add a layer of complexity that separates the Nightfarers who understand Limveld from those who simply survive it. Certain item locations are populated only in the early hours of the first night and cleared by the time the second begins, suggesting that the forces that generate those items are active, in a way that corresponds to the world's most dormant state and become inactive as the world's expression escalates. Certain NPC encounters are possible only in the transition between the second and third nights, in that specific window when the world is completing its transition from the second state to the third, and certain boundaries that are otherwise maintained are momentarily permeable. Learning to read these temporal patterns, to understand what is available when and why, is learning to read Limveld as the living cosmological document that it is. The specific silence that marks the transition from the second night to the third is one of the most discussed moments in the game among players who pay attention to atmosphere. It is not simply a pause in the ambient soundscape. It is a moment of actual silence, a brief period during which the sounds that have been filling the world, the sounds of creatures and wind and the general ambience of a living, if damaged, environment, simply stop. The silence lasts only a few seconds before the sounds of the third night begin. But those few seconds carry a quality of attention, as though the world has noticed something and is orienting toward it, as though Limveld has briefly paused its ongoing expression to acknowledge the arrival of the third night's specific quality. The silence is the world taking a breath before saying the most honest thing it will say all night. The three nights are the rhythm of Nightreign, the structure that organizes every expedition, and understanding them fully means understanding them not just as a gameplay loop but as a cosmological fact about Limveld and what it is currently doing. The three nights are not arbitrary. They are the expression in temporal form of a process that Limveld is undergoing, a process that has been running since the Catastrophe began and that continues through every expedition the Nightfarers undertake. The first night is Limveld at its most restrained. Not safe, not friendly, not easy by any ordinary measure, but restrained in the specific sense of a world that is containing the full expression of its current nature. The forces that define Limveld, the Nightlords and what they represent, are present in the first night but not fully manifest. What you encounter are expressions of those forces at a level of intensity that the world can sustain while still maintaining some of the forms and structures of the civilization that preceded the Catastrophe. The ruins are navigable. The enemies, while dangerous, fight in ways that are comprehensible. The sights of grace, even the ones that flicker, provide reliable rest. The first night is the world offering you a chance to understand it before it shows you what it is actually capable of. This restraint is not kindness. The world is not being generous in the first night. It is simply in its least activated state, the state that corresponds to the beginning of the cosmological cycle that the three nights represent. Every cycle of three nights begins with this relative dormancy and moves through escalating expression toward the full manifestation of the third night's Nightlord encounter. The first night is the inhale before the exhale, the potential before the kinetic, the world gathering itself for what follows. The second night is the transition between the relative dormancy of the first night and the full expression of the third. The second night occupies the most unstable position in the cycle. It is a world that is neither what it was nor fully what it is becoming, and this transitional quality produces the most unpredictable conditions of the three nights. Enemies that appeared in the first night appear again, but with a different quality, more fully expressive of whatever force animates them, more thoroughly of Limveld rather than of the civilization that preceded the Catastrophe. Areas that were navigable in the first night have shifted in ways that require the understanding gained in the first night to navigate effectively. The world is showing you more of itself, but not yet everything. The escalation of The second night is not linear. It does not simply make everything harder in the sense of increasing numbers and damage values. What escalates is the world's fundamental character, the degree to which it is expressing its post-catastrophe nature, rather than preserving the forms of its pre-catastrophe structure. By the end of the second night, you are in a world that is mostly what Limveld is now, rather than a world that mostly remembers what Limveld was before. The transition is complete enough that the third night can begin. The third night is the revelation. Everything that has been building across the first two nights, every escalation of the world's fundamental character, every step away from the forms of the old civilization and toward the full expression of the forces that replaced it, reaches its completion in the third night. The Nightlord that waits at the end of the third night is not simply a powerful enemy placed at the end of a challenge. It is the full manifestation of the force that has been shaping the entire expedition, the thing that the first two nights were a preparation for encountering. When you face the Nightlord at the end of the third night, you are facing the world as it fully and honestly is, without any of the residual forms of the old order softening its expression. The specific quality of the third night's darkness is worth attending to. It is not simply the absence of light, it is the presence of something that is not light, something that fills the space that light would otherwise occupy with a different quality of substance. The Nightlords are most powerful in this darkness, not because darkness is their elemental affinity in some simple mechanical sense, but because the darkness of the third night is their native medium, the condition that most completely expresses what they are. You are fighting them on their own terms, in the environment that most fully supports what they represent, and the difficulty of the encounter reflects this cosmological fact as much as it reflects any tuning of combat parameters. The cycle resets between expeditions. The world returns to its first night state. This reset is one of the most philosophically significant aspects of Nightreign, and one that players engage with differently depending on their orientation to the game. For players focused on the immediate experience of each expedition, the reset is simply the structure that allows the game to be replayed. For players focused on the lore, the reset raises questions that do not have comfortable answers. When the world resets, what happens to the events of the previous expedition? Were they real? Do they persist in any meaningful sense? Is the Limveld that begins the next expedition the same world as the one that ended the previous one? Or is it a fresh instantiation of the same template? The game's answer, to the extent that it has one, is that both are true simultaneously. The world resets in the sense that the physical state of Limveld returns to its initial conditions, but the world does not reset in the sense that the forces animating it, the Nightlords and what they represent, carry forward the information of what occurred in previous expeditions. The Nightlords have been fought before. They know, in whatever sense entities like them can know things, that Nightfarers come to Limveld and challenge them. The pattern of the three nights is not a fresh event each time. It is the ongoing expression of a process that has been running for as long as Nightfarers have been coming to Limveld. Each expedition is a new iteration of something that has been happening for a long time. This understanding changes the nature of the Nightfarers project. They're not trying to do something for the first time. They're trying to do something better than it has been done before. Every previous expedition that ended without achieving its fullest possible outcome was a preparation for this one. Every Nightfarer who came before and learned something from the experience and carried that learning forward, whether directly or through the accumulated understanding that gets transmitted through the community of people who engage with Limveld, contributed to the conditions that make the current expedition possible. The three nights are not a test you pass or fail. They are a practice that you engage with over time, and the quality of your engagement improves with each iteration. The relationship between the three nights and the time of day within each night adds another layer of complexity that rewards careful attention. The specific position of the world within each night, the point in the sky's progression from one phase to the next, correlates with changes in what is possible and what is dangerous in ways that experienced Nightfarers learn to read. Certain things that are accessible at one point in the first night become inaccessible as the night progresses. Certain dangers that are absent in the early second night emerge as it deepens. The world is not simply in two states, safe and dangerous, or even three states corresponding to the three nights. It is in continuous motion, always in the process of becoming the next thing, always moving through a spectrum of conditions that rewards the attention of those who learn to read it. The specific way each Nightlord moves within the world between combat encounters, the patterns they establish in the areas of Limveld where their influence is strongest, is worth examining as information about their nature. Gladius is never still. In the areas most thoroughly marked by its principle, the sense of constant motion and ongoing conflict is present even in the absence of direct combat, evident in the way environmental elements behave, in the way creatures that are not themselves, Gladius-affiliated, fight each other in patterns that reflect the escalation of conflict that Gladius's presence produces. Libra is almost perfectly still. The areas where it is strongest have a quality of suspended judgment, of a world waiting for a verdict that has not yet been delivered, but that is clearly being prepared. The relationship between the Nightlords and the specific locations in Limveld where they are encountered is not accidental. Each Nightlord appears in an environment that reflects and amplifies their specific principle, making the combat encounter not simply a test of fighting ability, but a total experience of the principle being opposed. Fighting Gladius in a space defined by ongoing conflict, where every element of the environment is oriented toward escalation, is fighting the idea of escalation with everything the idea can muster. Fighting Libra in a space of suspended judgment, where the world is organized around assessment and verdict, is fighting the idea of absolute judgment with everything that idea can bring to bear. The encounters are designed to be complete expressions of their principles, and understanding what you are fighting helps you understand how to fight it. The weapons that each Nightlord carries into combat and leaves behind when defeated are the most intimate objects in the game, the things that were most completely in contact with the principle they embodied, and their item descriptions carry the richest and most precise accounts of what each Nightlord is. Reading them carefully after a successful encounter is engaging with the lore at its most concentrated, receiving the full account of what was just defeated in the form that requires the most interpretive attention. The weapons are not trophies, they are records, and the record they carry is not simply of the Nightlord's power, but of its history, its origin, the specific process by which it became what the Nightfarers encountered at the end of the third night. The Nightlords are the defining presence of Nightreign. They are what Limveld has become organized around, the forces that shape the world's every expression, the entities that the three nights are building toward and the Nightfarers are being tested by. Understanding them fully means understanding them not simply as opponents, but as principles, as cosmological forces that have found physical expression in beings capable of direct interaction with the world and the people in it. Gladius is the first Nightlord that most players encounter, and the encounter is immediately clarifying about what kind of force Gladius represents. This is a being of pure martial expression, of the reduction of all possible interaction to its most combative form. Gladius does not negotiate, it does not assess, it does not wait or watch or calculate. It acts, with the complete commitment and the total presence of something that has no other mode. Every other way of being in the world, every form of interaction that is not combat, is simply absent from Gladius's repertoire. This is not limitation, it is completion. Gladius is exactly what it is with perfect thoroughness, and what it is a force of absolute martial engagement. The history of Gladius, reconstructed from item descriptions and environmental evidence, suggests a being that was not always what it is now. There are traces of a prior existence, a time before Gladius was fully Gladius, when what it is now was in process of becoming rather than complete. The weapon it leaves behind when defeated carries in its description references to service, to having been an instrument of something, to having been the cutting edge of a purpose that was not its own. Gladius was, at some point, a warrior in the more ordinary sense, a being whose combative excellence was in service of something beyond the combat itself. What that something was, and when and how it was lost or abandoned or consumed by the combat it expressed, is one of the mysteries that the game preserves. What we know is the after. What we can infer about the before makes the after more tragic. The connection between Gladius and the martial traditions of the lands between's Golden Order is thematic rather than genealogical. Gladius is not a former knight of Limveld or a failed champion of a forgotten tournament, but the principle it embodies, the idea that martial excellence is the highest expression of a being's nature, was genuinely present in the Golden Order's civilization in forms that were supposed to be subordinate to other values: service, devotion, justice. The martial excellence was supposed to be in service of these things. Gladius is what happens when the service is removed and only the excellence remains, when the instrument of higher purposes becomes a purpose unto itself. Libra is the most philosophically disturbing of the Nightlords, and its disturbance is of a specific and uncomfortable kind. Unlike Gladius, which is immediately recognizable as dangerous, Libra's principle, the principle of absolute and objective judgment, sounds like a virtue. We want our judges to be impartial. We want our courts to weigh evidence without favour. We want the assessment of value to be accurate rather than distorted by bias or sentiment. Libra represents all of these things in their fully realised form, and in that fully realised form they are catastrophic. The horror of Libra is in what falls outside its accounting, context, intention. The specific circumstances that make a given action by a given person in a given situation different from the same action by a different person in different circumstances. Mercy. The recognition that a strictly accurate accounting of value may not be the same thing as a just response to the situation being accounted for. These things are not weaknesses of ordinary judgment that Libra's perfection corrects. They are the dimensions of judgment that make it genuinely responsive to the complexity of living things. Libra's judgment is perfect and completely blind to everything that makes judgment matter. In Limveld, Libra's influence produced a civilization that could calculate with perfect precision and understand with increasing incomprehension. Courts became machines for verdict production rather than spaces for the working out of justice. Religious authorities became enforcers of compliance rather than guides toward wisdom. The institutions that were supposed to mediate between absolute principles and the complexity of human life became incapable of the mediation that was their reason for existing. The civilization did not become evil, it became inhuman, which in its own way was worse. Maris is the oldest of the Nightlords in the sense that what it represents is the oldest thing in Limveld's cosmological background. The deep water, the things that wait in it, the forces that the sea represents in the mythology of the lands between, and its alternate versions, these are presences that predate the Golden Order by a span that makes the Golden Order seem recent. Maris is the return of something ancient, something that was always there at the edges of the world that the civilization built over it, something that the civilization's maps marked as the border of the known world, without understanding that what was beyond the border was not simply unknown but very specifically known, in ways the civilization was not equipped to process. The relationship between Maris and the other outer gods of the Lands Between's mythology is one of the deepest and most rewarding lore threads in Nightreign for players familiar with the base game. The forces that operate from outside the world, the Greater Will and its competitors, have a specific relationship to water in the Lands Between's cosmology. Water is associated with memory, with the persistence of things that should have been lost, with the ancient presences that predate the current cosmological order. Maris is the expression of these associations in Nightlord form, the ancient and the deep given the capacity to act directly in the world rather than simply to exist at its edges. Equilibrion is the last of the original 4 Nightlords, and in some ways the most complete expression of what the Catastrophe did to Limveld, where Gladius represents the domination of one principle over all others, and Libra represents the domination of one mode of judgment over all others, and Maris represents the return of ancient forces that the civilization had, pushed to its edges. Equilibrion represents something more fundamental. It is the principle of irresolvable opposition, of the stasis that results when two equally matched forces press against each other, with neither able to yield, the specific kind of paralysis that occurs when a situation contains exactly equal reasons to move in two opposite directions. The name suggests balance, and balance is what Equilibrion produces, but it is balance in the sense of a scale with equal weights on both sides, rather than balance in the sense of a body moving gracefully through space. The scale is balanced. The scale is also completely unable to function as a scale. A measuring instrument in perfect balance between two equal weights cannot measure anything. A civilization in perfect equilibrium between competing forces cannot move in any direction. The catastrophe that Equilibrion represents is not the catastrophe of defeat. It is the catastrophe of perfect stalemate, of a world that has run out of the capacity to resolve its own internal tensions and has frozen in the position of maximum opposition. The 2 Nightlords of the Forsaken Hollows DLC, Balancer and Dreeglord, add to the Nightlord mythology in ways that retrospectively complete the picture the original 4 established. Balancer addresses a dimension of cosmic accounting, of the idea that existence itself maintains a ledger, and that debts accumulate and are eventually called. Dreeglord addresses the accumulation of what is discarded, the patient gathering of everything that civilizations and cosmic processes throw away as insufficient or irrelevant. Together with the original 4, they constitute a complete taxonomy of the forces that Limveld's catastrophe has unleashed, a full account of what happens when a world's internal tensions are exploited by external forces that thrive in conditions of instability. The areas of Limveld where the Forsaken Hollows are most concentrated provide some of the richest environmental storytelling in the game for players willing to move slowly through them, rather than treating them primarily as combat zones. The specific objects and structures that surround Forsaken Hollow enemies in their areas of concentration were placed there by the civilization that preceded the catastrophe, and their relationship to the hollows that now move among them tells a story about the specific moments and specific circumstances of severance. A forsaken hollow, found among the ruins of what was clearly a site of religious practice, was in that place when the connection to grace in that area was severed. A forsaken hollow, found in what appears to have been a residential area, was in their home when the catastrophe reached them. The location is biographical. The surroundings are a form of frozen autobiography. The forsaken hollows that appear in areas adjacent to still functioning sites of grace are the most poignant environmental detail in the DLC. They are close enough to grace to be in its light. They cannot receive it. The severance that made them what they are is not a physical distance from grace, but a specific break in the connection that allows grace to be received, and that break is not repaired by proximity. They stand in the light of grace and cannot be warmed by it, and the specific quality of their presence in those areas, their orientation toward the grace light and their inability to access what it offers, is the most precise image in the game of what it means to be forsaken. Near the thing you lost, unable to reach it, knowing exactly what you are missing, and being unable to close the distance that is not a distance. The Forsaken Hollows DLC expanded Nightreign in ways that most players experienced as more content, but that are, from a lore perspective, a completion of what the base game was always gesturing toward. The base game established the world and its major dynamics. The DLC fills in the dimensions that the base game's world implied without exploring, adding depth in exactly the directions where more depth was most needed. The Forsaken Hollows themselves are the DLC's most important lore contribution, and understanding them requires understanding what hollowing actually is in the context of Nightreign's mythology, rather than simply in the mechanical context of the base game's progression systems. In the Dark Souls trilogy, and in the original Elden Ring, hollowing was a process of losing oneself, the gradual erosion of purpose and identity that occurred when a being was denied the grace or connection that sustained their sense of self. It was described as a curse, as a degradation, as something that happened to people rather than something that was done to them. The Forsaken Hollows complicate this understanding significantly. They are beings who were not gradually worn down into hollowness. They were cut off. The distinction is crucial. A gradual erosion is the result of a condition, an ongoing circumstance that slowly removes what it removes. A severance is an act, something done at a specific moment by a specific cause, producing an immediate rather than gradual transformation. The Forsaken Hollows were connected to something, to grace, to a relationship with the divine infrastructure of the Golden Order's civilization, and that connection was deliberately severed, not allowed to fade, cut. What remains after a connection is severed is different from what remains after it fades. A faded connection leaves a being that has lost something gradually and adapted to the loss in the way that living things adapt to gradual change. A severed connection leaves a being that was full one moment and empty the next, that carries the specific trauma of sudden absence, that knows exactly what was there and is no longer there because the knowing is more immediate and more specific than any gradual loss could produce. The Forsaken Hollows are beings in the specific agony of sudden divine abandonment, and their behaviour, their relentless hostility and their specific quality of presence in the world reflects this agony rather than the more diffuse purposelessness of ordinary hollowing. Why were they severed? The answer is connected to the cosmological process that created Limveld's current state. As the Nightlords' influence deepened, and the connections between Limveld and the greater wills divine, infrastructure became unstable. The severing of those connections was not always a gradual process. In some cases, particularly in areas where the Nightlord's influence was most concentrated and most rapid in its expression, the connections that sustained individual beings' relationship to grace simply broke. The Forsaken Hollows are the casualties of those breaks, beings who were in the wrong place when the infrastructure of the divine relationship collapsed in their area. They did not lose their grace by hollowing out. They lost it by being present when a part of the system that sustained grace in their area simply stopped working. This understanding changes the nature of the encounter with Forsaken Hollows significantly. They are not enemies in the sense of beings that have chosen to oppose the Nightfarers. They are victims who've been rendered dangerous by what was done to them. The hostility they direct toward anyone who enters their presence is not malice. It is pain. The specific pain of severance, which looks from the outside like aggression, but is from the inside the expression of a loss so complete and so sudden that it has consumed every other mode of being. Fighting Forsaken Hollows is fighting beings who are suffering in a way that they cannot express, except through the expression of that suffering, which happens to take the form of violence. Balancer is the first of the DLC's 2 new Nightlords, and its principle is the most abstract of all the Nightlords' principles, which is appropriate for a being that has been doing what it does for longer than any of the others have been doing what they do. Balancer maintains a ledger. This is the simplest possible description of its principle, and also the most complete one. Everything that exists, every action taken, every resource consumed, every life lived and ended, every civilization built and collapsed, enters the ledger as a credit or a debit. The ledger must balance. This is not a preference or a policy. It is the fundamental law that Balancer represents and enforces. The specific entry that Limveld's civilization made in Balancer's ledger, the specific credit they took and the debt they accumulated in the process of taking it, is encoded in the item descriptions associated with Balancer's weapons and in the environmental evidence of the areas where it is encountered. The civilization took something, the ledger registered the taking. The civilization collapsed before the debt could be repaid through ordinary means, and Balancer, with the patience of something that has been maintaining its ledger since before any of the current world's institutions existed, has been waiting for the balance to be restored by whatever means are available. The Nightfarers who defeat Balancer are not cancelling the debt. They are, in some cosmological sense, making a payment toward it, demonstrating through the specific act of confronting this force that something has been invested in the attempt to restore what was disrupted. Dreglord is the final Nightlord and the one whose principle is most intimately connected to the experience of walking through Limveld as an explorer rather than a combatant. Every ruin you examine, every item you pick up from a defeated enemy, every material you harvest from the landscape is something that Dreglord's principle accounts for. Dreglord is the accumulation of what is left over, the patient gathering of everything that was discarded, dismissed, declared insufficient or irrelevant or exhausted by the processes that produced it. The dregs are what remain after the valuable material has been extracted, and Dreglord has been collecting them for a very long time. What makes Dreglord significant beyond its role as a formidable combat encounter is what its existence implies about the nature of the world that produced it. A Dreglord exists in a world that has been generating dregs, that has been extracting value from things and discarding the remainder at a scale and duration sufficient to produce a Nightlord out of the accumulation. Limveld's civilization generated dregs. The processes of the Golden Order's civilization generated dregs. the cosmic processes that shaped the lands between and its alternate versions, generated dregs. And all of those dregs, everything discarded and dismissed and declared insufficient across the full span of this world's history, went somewhere. Dreglord is where they went. Dreglord is everything that was not deemed worth keeping, kept anyway, accumulated into a force that can no longer be dismissed. The items left behind by people who inhabited the Round Table Hold before its evacuation are among the most personally affecting lore objects in Nightreign. They are ordinary things, the kind of things that people bring to a place they intend to occupy for a significant period of time, items that reflect individual personalities and preferences, and the specific quality of life that was being lived in the hold before it had to be abandoned. A book left open at a specific page, a weapon that was being maintained and never finished, a piece of equipment that was clearly being modified and that still carries the marks of the modification in progress. These ordinary objects are the most human things in Limveld, and their presence in the evacuated hold, preserved exactly as they were left, is a form of memory that the world maintains despite everything that has happened to it. The presence of the finger readers in Limveld connects to one of the most fundamental questions about the nature of interpretation itself. If interpretation is a practice, a skill, a trained capacity that once developed operates regardless of what it is pointed at, then a finger reader without two fingers is a person with an interpretive capacity without an obvious object for that capacity. What happens to an interpretive practice when it loses its designated object? Does it stop? Does it find another object? Does it continue toward the original object even in its absence, reading the space where the two fingers were as though the reading itself might eventually conjure what it is reading for? The finger readers of Limveld appear to be doing something like the third option, and whether that is devotion or delusion is a question the game puts in front of you without answering. One of the most carefully constructed aspects of Nightraign's world building is the way it populates Limveld with presences that players of the original game will recognise while making those presences genuinely different from what they remember. The familiar faces of Nightreign are not simply the original game's characters transplanted into a new setting. They are versions of those characters, or echoes of them, or beings in a relationship to those characters that the game establishes without fully explaining. Understanding what each familiar presence means in the context of Limveld adds a dimension to both the original game and Nightreign that neither fully possesses on its own. Melina is the most significant and most discussed of the familiar presences, and her appearance in Nightreign raises questions that the game is very careful not to answer too directly. In the original Elden Ring, Melina was the Tarnished's guide, the being who appeared at sites of grace, and offered to help the player character level up in exchange for being taken to the Erdtree. She was defined by her connection to Marika, by the purpose she carried that she could not fully remember, and by the sacrifice she was willing to make in service of a goal that she believed in even when its ultimate justification was unclear. The Melina who appears in Limveld is different in ways that accumulate over the course of careful play into a picture of a being who has a relationship to this world that goes beyond simply being a familiar character in a new setting. She knows things about Limveld that she should not know. She speaks about the Nightlords with the specificity that implies direct familiarity. She refers to the patterns of the three knights with the ease of someone who has watched them run many times, rather than someone encountering them for the first. When she speaks to Nightfarers, the specific quality of her address implies a history with them that is not explainable by a single meeting at the beginning of an expedition. The most compelling interpretation of Melina's presence in Nightreign supported by the available evidence, is that she has been in Limveld before, not as a visitor but as someone with an ongoing relationship to the world, someone who comes here and returns and comes here again in a cycle that parallels the 3-night cycle of the expeditions themselves. Whether she was sent here by Marika, or by something that used to be Marika, or by her own choice, or by a force that neither she nor Marika controls, is not established by the game. What is established is that her presence in Limveld is not accidental, and that the knowledge she carries about this world was not obtained from a single visit. The Round Table Hold appears in Limveld in a form that is immediately recognisable and deeply wrong. The layout is there, the general atmosphere is there, the specific quality of the space, the sense of being somewhere that exists slightly outside ordinary geography is there. What is not there is anyone. The hold in Limveld is evacuated, not abandoned in the gradual way of a place that was slowly depopulated over time, but evacuated in the sudden way of a place that people left very quickly for a reason that required immediate departure. Objects are displaced from where they should be. Doors are open that should be closed. The specific quality of disruption that the space contains is the disruption of interruption, rather than of gradual decay. What happened here? The environmental evidence supports a specific reconstruction. The Round Table Hold of Limveld was active. People gathered here, in the same way that people gathered at its counterpart in the original game, using it as a hub for planning and preparation, and the specific kind of community that develops among people who are undertaking a shared dangerous project. And then something happened that caused everyone to leave at once. The cause of the evacuation is not specified directly, but the timing implied by the evidence connects it to one of the Nightlords' escalations, a moment when the world outside the hold became dangerous in a way that outpaced the hold's capacity to offer safety. The finger readers who appear in Limveld are perhaps the most quietly disturbing of the familiar presences, because their continued function in the absence of what their function depends on raises questions that are difficult to answer comfortably. These women, whose purpose in the original game was to interpret the gestures of the two fingers, are present in Limveld doing what they have always done: interpreting, reading, translating the meaning of gestures into comprehensible guidance for those who lack the capacity to perceive those gestures directly. But the two fingers, those physical emissaries of the greater will whose gestures the finger readers exist to interpret, are not visibly present in Limveld. Are the finger readers reading nothing, continuing their professional practice out of habit or compulsion, or the inability to conceive of themselves outside their function? Or are they reading something that occupies the role that the two fingers occupied, but that is not the two fingers, something that communicates in the same register and through the same gestural vocabulary, but that represents a different source of guidance? The game's answer is not definitive. Both interpretations are supported by available evidence, and the ambiguity between them is itself meaningful, is itself a statement about the nature of guidance and interpretation in a world where the sources of authority have become uncertain. The Keeper, the NPC who manages the hub between expeditions, is the familiar face that most Nightreign players spend the most time with and think the least carefully about, which is a shame because the Keeper's lore is among the most rewarding in the game. They are competent and warm and helpful, and they know things about Limveld that they should not know, given any simple account of how they came to be here. The most careful reading of all available evidence about the Keeper produces a picture of someone who was, before they were the Keeper, a Nightfarer, someone who came to Limveld as part of an expedition, experienced the 3 nights, and at some point for some reason did not return to wherever they came from. They stayed. And in staying, they became something different from what they were, neither the Nightfarer they were, nor entirely what they have since become. A being whose relationship to Limveld is more intimate than any visitors and less than any natives. The question of what the endings mean for the people who did not achieve them, for the Nightfarers who were part of expeditions that ended before their fullest possible conclusion, is one that the game addresses through the accumulated experience of returning players rather than through explicit narrative. Every expedition that ends in the stability ending when the deeper understanding ending was theoretically possible is an expedition that learned something but not everything. Every expedition that ends in one Nightfarer remaining while others return is an expedition that produced a specific distribution of choices and consequences that becomes part of the shared understanding of what Limveld is and what it asks of those who come to it. The endings are not simply the destinations of individual expeditions. They are the data points of an ongoing investigation into what Limveld is and what response to it is possible. The specific emotional quality of each ending, distinct from its narrative content, is worth attending to as information about what the game believes the choice it represents actually costs. The stability ending has a quality of exhausted relief, of something that could not have been sustained indefinitely finally being allowed to rest even briefly. The remaining ending has a quality of resolution without triumph, of a decision that is genuinely a decision rather than a surrender, but that the person making it knows will not be easy to live with. The deeper understanding ending has a quality of completeness, of something being genuinely finished rather than simply paused, and that completeness is suffused with the specific sadness that attends anything that is genuinely finished, the recognition that the ending is real. Each emotional register is accurate to what the choice actually involves. The game does not promise that the best ending feels the best. It promises that each ending feels like what it is. Every ending in Nightreign is the answer to a question, and the question is the same in every case, asked from different angles and answered with different consequences. The question is this: given everything you now know about Limveld, given the full understanding of what it is and how it came to be, and what the forces operating within it actually represent, what do you do? The ending's not ranked. The game does not tell you which one is right. It presents each one as the genuine consequence of a genuine choice made by someone who understood what they were choosing. The ending of temporary stability is the most immediately satisfying and the most clearly incomplete. 3 nights survived. The Night Lord of the 3rd night defeated. The expedition, successful in the terms that define expedition success. Limveld achieves a quieter state. The sights of grace stop flickering. The landscape settles into something that resembles for a time the world it was before the catastrophe. The Nightfarers, those who survived, return to wherever they came from, or remain in Limveld in its relative peace. The incompleteness is built into the ending itself, acknowledged rather than concealed. The forces that the Nightlords represent are not destroyed by defeating their current manifestations. They persist in the cosmological background of Limveld, in the spaces between what is visible and what is merely latent. The stability that the ending achieves is real stability, not an illusion or a false resolution, but it is stability of a kind that requires maintenance, and that will not maintain itself indefinitely without continued effort. The morning after the 3rd night is earned and genuine. It is also the beginning of the work of keeping the morning, and the ending does not pretend otherwise. The ending in which one or more Nightfarers choose to remain in Limveld is the most personal and the most resistant to general characterization, because what it means depends entirely on which Nightfarer makes the choice and why. For the Wilder, remaining might mean finding something in Limveld that is worth staying for after a long history of not finding things worth staying for. For the Guardian, it might mean committing to the ongoing work of protecting a world that needs protection, finally in a context where the protection is clearly needed rather than possibly superfluous. For the Revenant, it might mean accepting that the question of whether they are continuous with who they were before their death is less important than who they are in the world they currently inhabit. The shared quality across all the Nightfarer-specific versions of this ending is the acceptance of impermanence as a condition rather than a problem. The Nightfarer who chooses to remain in Limveld is choosing to make a home in a world that does not offer the stability that home usually implies, that will continue to cycle through its 3 nights, that will continue to require the ongoing work of survival and understanding rather than settling into the comfortable permanence that most conceptions of home assume. This is either a profound act of acceptance or a specific form of resignation, and the game is honest that it cannot tell you which. The ending of deeper understanding is the rarest and the most demanding to achieve, requiring a quality of attention to the world across multiple expeditions that goes beyond the ordinary competence of completing the 3 nights and defeating the Nightlord. This ending occurs when the Nightfarers not only defeat the Nightlord of the 3rd night, but demonstrate, through the specific choices and discoveries made across all 3 nights, a sufficient understanding of the forces that Nightlord represents to address those forces at a level deeper than their current manifestation. It is the difference between defeating a symptom and addressing a cause, between fighting the expression of a principle and engaging with the principle itself. This ending changes Limveld in a more fundamental way than the stability ending. The world does not simply become quieter, it becomes differently organised. The cosmological principles that underlie its current state altered in ways that make the next cycle's Nightlords different from the current ones, that move the world toward a state that is less fully dominated by the forces of the catastrophe, and more genuinely in the process of integrating those forces into a new kind of order. It is not restoration of the old order, it is not creation of some imagined perfect state, it is the beginning of something genuinely new, which is the most that can be achieved in a world that has been through what Limveld has been through. The ending in which the Nightfarers succeed in what the civilization failed at, in finding a response to the Nightlords that the civilization's resources and understanding did not allow it to find, is the most thematically complete of the available conclusions. It does not simply defeat the immediate threat, it demonstrates that what was lost in the catastrophe is not permanently beyond recovery, that the understanding that the civilization lacked can be developed by those who come after and engage with the world differently. This ending is the game's most hopeful statement, and it is hopeful in the specific way that hopeful things are hopeful in From Software games, not naively or easily, or without acknowledgement of the full cost of what it took to get here, but genuinely. The hope is real, it was earned, and earning it required everything. The world of Limveld is, in the most fundamental sense, a world that is asking to be understood, not simply to be survived, not simply to be conquered, to be understood in the specific sense of having its history read and its forces engaged with at the level of their principles rather than simply their expressions, of having the full complexity of what it is acknowledged by the beings who enter it rather than treated as obstacle or backdrop. The Nightfarers who achieve the deepest endings do so not because they are the strongest or the most skilled, but because they are the most attentive, the ones who treated Limveld as information rather than simply as challenge, who paid the kind of attention that the world rewards because it is the kind of attention the world was built to require. This is the common thread that runs through all the From Software games and finds its most explicit expression in Nightreign. The world rewards attention, not simply skill, not simply persistence, attention. The willingness to look at what is there rather than what you expected to find. The capacity to hold complexity without immediately resolving it into something simpler and more manageable. The patience to sit with the question until the answer that is actually there becomes legible, rather than substituting an answer that is easier to work with. These games teach this lesson through their design, through the way that success comes to those who pay attention and eludes those who try to brute force their way through. Nightreign teaches the same lesson through its story, through the Nightfarers who succeed not because they are chosen, but because they are paying attention. The final image of Nightreign, whatever ending has been achieved, is always of a world that continues. Limveld does not disappear when the expedition ends. It does not resolve into some final state of completion or destruction. It persists, changed by what occurred but not ended by it, ready for the next expedition, and the next set of Nightfarers, and the next iteration of the three knights, and whatever understanding the next group of careful, attentive people will bring to it. The world is patient. It has been here since before the catastrophe. It will be here after whatever the current expeditions produce. And in its patience, in its ongoing availability to those who come to it with genuine attention, it offers something that is not comfort exactly, but is the closest thing to comfort that a world this strange and this broken is capable of offering. It is still here. It is still full of things worth finding, and it will be here when you return. The entire story of Nightreign, from the civilization that built roads in a world that would eventually be unable to maintain them, to the Nightfarers who walk those roads on their way to confronting the forces that ended everything the roads connected, is a story about the relationship between what was and what is, and about whether what could be is accessible from that relationship. Every From Software game is about cycles. The Age of Fire and the Age of Dark, the linking of the fire and the walking away from it, the shattering and the restoration. The cycle is always the thing that the story circles around, and the question it always asks is what to do with a cycle that you can see clearly enough to understand, but that you are not sure you can escape. Nightreign asks this question in its most intimate form. The three nights cycle, the world resets, the expeditions repeat. What do you do with the cycle you're inside? The game's answer is the same answer that the best of its predecessors gave, stated in a new way for a new context. You pay attention. You bring what you learned from the last time and you apply it to this time. You cooperate with the people who are in the cycle with you, because you cannot do what needs to be done alone. You resist the temptation to treat the repetition as meaningless simply because it repeats, because the meaning of a thing is not determined by its frequency, and you keep going, not forever, not without rest, but with the specific quality of commitment that comes from having decided that the effort is worth making, even when the outcome is uncertain. The Nightfarers embody this answer in their specific ways. The Wilder finds enough meaning in the immediate task to keep going. The Duchess brings the weight of a tradition that, even without the institution that produced it, still provides orientation. The Guardian tries again for the thing they failed at, with the specific determination that only a real failure can produce. The recluse applies her understanding to a world that is the object of that understanding. The Iron Eye brings the peace of acceptance to a world that needs people who can work within impermanence rather than only despite it. The Raider brings the habits of community to a context that needs community to function. The Executor discovers what they are when not defined by service. The Revenant continues, uncertain of their own continuity because the continuation is what they have. Together they are the game's answer to the question of how to be in a world that keeps changing. Not heroes in the traditional sense, not chosen ones in the sense of beings uniquely destined for greatness. People who are called, who showed up, who worked with what they had and who they were with, and who found in the doing of the difficult thing a form of meaning that could not have been found any other way. Limveld teaches the same lesson that all the From Software worlds teach, stated in the specific vocabulary of this specific world. The lesson is not that suffering is redemptive, or that loss is secretly good, or that the things that were destroyed deserve to be destroyed. Those are not the lessons. The lesson is simpler and harder. It is that after the loss, after the catastrophe, after everything that was built has been transformed into something that bears only the shape of what it was, there is still something to do. There is still the work of understanding what happened and why. There is still the possibility of building something from what remains, not what was there before, because that is gone, but something new, that the specific combination of what remains and who is present to work with it makes possible. There is still the morning after the third night, and the morning is worth fighting for even when the fight is uncertain, and the morning, when it comes, is not the morning that was hoped for, but simply the morning that was earned. The Nightfarers earn their mornings, one expedition at a time, one night at a time, with whatever they brought with them from the worlds they came from, and whatever they found in Limveld, and whatever they built together in the 3 nights they shared. They earn the morning, and they know, all of them, that the next night will come, and they go in anyway, because going in is what they do, because the world needs people who go in, because the alternative to going in is a world that has no one in it who is paying the kind of attention that Limveld needs someone to pay. That is the entire story of Nightreign, a world that needed someone to pay attention to it. 8 people who were called to pay that attention, 3 nights in which to do it. And the morning earned, real, provisional, beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they should not exist and do anyway. The 8 Nightfarers, taken together as a group, represent something that the game does not name, but that is visible in how they function together across expeditions. They represent a complete set of responses to loss. The Wielder represents the response of letting go of the lost thing entirely and finding sufficiency in what remains. The Duchess represents the response of carrying the lost thing as identity, of making the loss the foundation of a continued sense of self. The Guardian represents the response of treating the loss as obligation, of using the failure that the loss involved as the basis for renewed commitment. The Recluse represents the response of treating the loss as information, of studying what was lost in order to understand something that the losing revealed. The Iron Eye represents the response of acceptance, of incorporating the loss into a way of being that is not defined by the absence but is genuinely shaped by it. The Raider represents the response of continuation, of carrying the lost thing forward in practice even when the thing itself no longer exists. The Executor represents the response of interrogation, of using the loss to question what the lost thing actually was and whether it deserved the commitment it received. The Revenant represents the response of uncertainty, of being unable to determine whether the self that continues after the loss is the same self that existed before it. Every person who has lost something significant will recognize one or more of these responses in themselves. The game is not prescribing which response is correct. It is acknowledging that all of them are real, that real people respond to real losses in all of these ways, and that each response produces a specific kind of person with specific capabilities and specific limitations. By assembling all 8, Nightreign is saying that what is needed to address what Limveld has become requires the full range of responses to loss, not any single approach to grief, but all of them, in conversation with each other, producing together what none of them could produce separately. This is the game's most generous and most honest statement about humanity. We lose things. We respond to our losses in different ways. And the combination of our different responses to loss is what makes us capable of facing a world that has also lost something essential about itself, and that needs people who understand loss in all its forms to help it find a way forward. The sights of grace that still glow in Limveld, even the ones that flicker, even the ones whose light is uncertain and whose connection to whatever sustains them has been compromised by everything the catastrophe did to the world's cosmological infrastructure, represent something important that the story of Nightreign spends considerable time establishing. They are the remnants of a relationship between the world and the divine that the catastrophe damaged but could not entirely sever. They are the evidence that what was built between the civilization of Limveld and the forces that sustained it was real enough to leave traces that persist, even in the absence of the civilization that built the relationship. The grace may flicker, the sights may occasionally go dark, but they are still there. They still offer rest. They still provide the specific form of renewal that makes continued effort possible. The Nightfarers who rest at these uncertain sites of grace are doing something that the game does not make dramatic, but that deserves to be recognized as significant. They are trusting an uncertain connection. They are laying down their weapons and closing their eyes and accepting the renewal that the uncertain grace offers, trusting that it will be there when they need it rather than demanding guarantees before they commit to the rest that will allow them to continue. This is not naivety. The experienced Nightfarer has seen the sights of grace flicker and has seen them hold. They know that the connection is uncertain, and they rest anyway, because the rest is necessary, and the uncertainty, while real, is not so complete as to make the risk of resting greater than the certainty of failing to rest. This acceptance of uncertain grace in exchange for necessary rest is the game's most intimate statement about faith. Not faith in any specific religious sense. Faith in the more fundamental sense of proceeding on the basis of a connection that cannot be fully verified, of trusting something that has been reliable enough to be worth trusting even when the reliability cannot be guaranteed. The Nightfarers are people who have learned to sleep on uncertain ground, who have found that the uncertainty does not make the rest less restful, or the renewal less real. And in learning this, they have found something that the civilization that built the sites of grace in the first place perhaps never had to learn, because their grace was certain. The Nightfarers have learned to be grateful for the uncertain version of what the civilization took for granted in its certain form. The architecture of the pre-catastrophe civilization, even in its ruined state, still communicates the values of the people who built it. Buildings that prioritize light, that use their positioning and their window placements to maximize the presence of natural light within their interiors, were buildings designed by people who valued visibility, who believed that seeing clearly was important, and worth the structural investment required to achieve it. Buildings that prioritize gathering spaces over private spaces were designed by people who valued community over privacy, who believed that the time people spent together was more important than the time they spent alone. Buildings that prioritize the accommodation of the sacred, the specific spaces set aside for contact with whatever forces the civilization believed worthy of contact, were designed by people who believed that the sacred was real and important enough to deserve dedicated architectural expression. Reading these values in the ruins, tracing the priorities of a civilization through the way it chose to use space and material and labour, is one of the most humanizing things you can do in Limveld. The people who built this world had values, real ones, values that they expressed in the things they made and the way they made them. The catastrophe took the civilization. It could not take the values, because the values are encoded in the physical objects that survive the civilization, in the roads and the ruins and the architecture that the Nightfarers move through every time they enter Limveld. The people are gone, but something of who they were is still here, in the shape of everything they built. The roads of Limveld deserve one final meditation before we close, because they are the detail that most completely encapsulates what the entire story of this world is about. Someone built those roads. They required planning and labour, and the specific kind of institutional investment that only happens when a civilization believes it will exist long enough for the investment to pay off. The roads were built by people who believed in the future, who thought their world would persist, who made a commitment to the long term in the form of infrastructure that would serve not just themselves, but those who came after them. Those people are gone. The world they believed in has been transformed into something they would not have recognized. The civilization that built the roads has left almost nothing that survives intact except the roads themselves, and the roads still work. They still connect the places they were built to connect, still provide easier travel between the ruins of a world that believed in its own continuation. The Nightfarers walk these roads. They use the infrastructure of a dead civilization to move through the world that replaced it, and in using those roads, in benefiting from the investment that the people who built them made in a future that never arrived. The Nightfarers carry something of those people forward, not their institutions, not their religious practices or their political structures or their understanding of how the world worked, simply the physical expression of their belief that the future was worth building for. This is the most honest thing Nightreign has to say about the civilization that the catastrophe destroyed and the world that the catastrophe produced. The catastrophe was real. The loss was real. The things that were built and believed in and valued and then taken away were genuinely worth the grief their loss produces. And something persists, not what was hoped for, not the specific future that the roads were built to serve, but the roads. And the roads are enough to walk on, and having something to walk on in a world that has been through what Limveld has been through is not nothing. It is the beginning of the possibility of going somewhere. The Nightfarers go somewhere. Every expedition is the use of those roads for a purpose the people who built them could not have anticipated. Not maintenance of the civilization, not service of its institutions, something new. Something that the catastrophe made necessary, and that the roads made possible, and that the specific combination of these 8 people with these specific histories and these specific things to prove and these specific things to grieve makes achievable in ways that neither the old civilization nor any simpler response to its loss could have produced. That is the entire story of Nightreign. a world that believed in itself enough to build roads, a catastrophe that destroyed everything the roads were built to serve, and people who walk those roads anyway, who use what was left to go somewhere worth going, who find in the ruins of what was something worth building on. The night ends when it ends. The morning comes when it comes, and when it comes there will be roads to walk on. The Nightfarers will keep going into Limveld. The 3 knights will keep cycling. The Nightlords will keep waiting at the end of the 3rd night. And somewhere in all of that repetition, in all of that ongoing effort in a world that keeps changing and keeps asking and keeps offering its mornings to those who earn them, something accumulates. Not a solution, not a final answer, something more valuable than either of those. Understanding. Genuine, hard-won, specific understanding of a world that contains everything it contains. And that is worth knowing completely. That is what Nightreign offers. That is what we have been building toward tonight. And now you have it. The complete story of Elden Ring Nightreign told in full for those patient enough to receive it. There is one more thing worth saying before sleep finds you. One final observation about the story we've told tonight and why it matters beyond its entertainment value or its completeness as a lore account. The story of Nightreign is a story about a world that was built, that believed in itself, that invested in its own future, and that was destroyed by forces that exploited the specific nature of what it was. This is not a unique story. It is, in various forms, the story of every civilization that has ended. The specific cosmological vocabulary is unique to Nightreign. The shape of the story is not. Every civilization that has ended was built by people who believed in it. Every civilization that has ended was vulnerable in ways that the people inside it did not fully understand until the vulnerability was exploited. Every civilization that has ended left behind roads and ruins and artifacts that carry the values and the investment and the specific quality of life that the civilization produced. What makes Nightreign's telling of this story worth the hours we have spent with it is not that it is unique, but that it is honest. It does not pretend that the civilization of Limveld deserved what happened to it. It does not pretend that the forces that destroyed it were justified. It does not pretend that the Nightfarers who come to address the aftermath are heroes in the sense of beings whose heroism is guaranteed by their designation as protagonists. It simply shows you the world as it is, tells you what happened to make it that way, and presents you with the people who are doing what they can with what they have, and it asks you to pay attention to all of it, to the world and to the loss and to the people, and to the effort and to the mornings that are earned in the face of everything that argues against them. Pay attention. That is the whole request. That is everything Nightreign is asking of you. Pay attention to a world that deserves attention, and in paying it, receive what only genuine attention can give you. The understanding that this world, broken as it is still worth understanding, still worth the hours it takes to know it, still worth the care it takes to see it clearly. You have paid that attention tonight. You understand this world now. Rest well. You have earned it. The world of Limveld is patient. It has been here since before the catastrophe shaped it into what it is now. It will continue to be here after whatever the current expeditions produce. Its patience is not indifference. It is the patience of something that knows it has something to offer and is willing to wait for the people who are ready to receive it. You have been ready tonight. You have received what it has to offer in the form of its complete story, told slowly and carefully and with the specific attention that this world deserves. Take that with you, into sleep, into the next time you play, into whatever comes after tonight. The morning after a third night in Limveld is the most earned thing in the game. Not earned in the sense of deserved, in the sense of something owed to someone who has worked hard enough. Earned in the sense of produced through specific effort and specific attention and specific cooperation through 3 people bringing what they have to 3 nights that tested it and finding that what they had was enough. The morning is not guaranteed, it is not promised. It arrives when the work of the 3 nights has been sufficient to produce it, and when it arrives, it is real. Limveld will have another 3 nights. The forces that the Nightlords represent will still be present in the world's cosmological background, still pressing against the relative stability that the expedition's success produced. The next Nightfarers who come will face their own 3 nights, their own Nightlords, their own specific combination of who they are and what they carry and what the world will ask of them. The cycle does not end, but the cycle is not nothing. Each iteration of the cycle, each set of 3 nights that is faced by 3 people paying genuine attention, produces something. Understanding, stability, however provisional, the morning, however temporary. And the accumulation of those mornings, the ongoing production of earned dawns in a world that has no guarantee of them, is what Nightreign is ultimately about. It is about earning the morning, over and over, in a world that makes the earning necessary and genuinely worth doing. The sound of Limveld at rest, in those brief moments between expeditions when the world has returned to its first night dormancy and before the next expedition has begun, is one of the most carefully composed sonic experiences in the game. It is not silence, Limveld is never truly silent, but it is the quietest version of itself, the state in which the forces that animate it are most contained, most restrained, most like the world they displaced rather than the world they created. In this quietness, the sounds of the old civilization are most audible. The wind moves through architectural spaces that were designed to accommodate it in specific ways, producing the sounds that those spaces were built to produce. The water moves through channels that were engineered to manage it, making the sounds that managed water makes. Even in its ruined and transformed state, Limveld occasionally sounds like what it was, and in those moments of accidental acoustic fidelity, the loss of what it was becomes most present and most specific. The Nightfarers who have spent enough time in Limveld to learn its sounds, to distinguish the sounds of the old world from the sounds of the transformed one, are the Nightfarers who are most thoroughly paying the kind of attention that Limveld rewards. They hear what is there, they hear what is absent, they hear the difference between the two. And in hearing all of this, they understand the world they are in with a completeness that goes beyond what can be seen or read or logically deduced. They know Limveld the way you know a place you have lived in long enough to feel its rhythms in your body rather than simply in your mind. This embodied understanding is the deepest form of the attention the game is asking for. It is the understanding that makes the difference between someone who survived Limveld and someone who understood it. The ending you carry with you from tonight, from these hours in Limveld's story, is not one of the game's codified endings. It is the ending that belongs to this specific experience, this particular journey through the complete narrative of Nightreign, told slowly and carefully, and with the specific quality of attention that long-form lore content makes possible. You know the story now. You know where it began, and how it developed and what it produced and what the people inside it found when they looked hard enough at a world that was asking to be understood. That knowledge is yours. It belongs to you in the way that only things genuinely attended to can belong to you. And it will be there when you play the game, or when you return to it, or when you think about it in the quiet moments that these hours of listening sometimes produce. Before we rest, I want to pause and thank you for being here tonight. We've been through the entire story of Nightreign from the beginning to every possible ending, and if you made it this far, you now understand this world as completely as any lore video can give you. If this meant something to you, please subscribe to Nightfall Lore and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me which part of the story landed hardest. Tell me which Nightfarer you connected with most and why. Every comment, every subscription, every share is what makes these long and careful videos possible, and I am grateful for every single one. Rest now. The story is told. Limveld will cycle through its 3 nights without you for a while. The Nightfarers will handle it. The Nightlords will wait at the end of their 3rd nights as they always wait, and the world will be there, full of its secrets and its history and its specific kind of beauty that should not exist in a world as broken as this one whenever you are ready to return to it. You understand it now. You know what happened and why and what it means. Sleep well, good Nightfarer. May the night end when it ends.